Our daughter Rachel was born in the Philippines, April 14, 1986. Rachel was 3 days old when her pediatrician told me he thought she had a heart problem and wanted to call in a pediatric cardiologist. The doctor performed an x-ray and an EKG. Rachel was immediately put on oxygen and started on the drug Glenoxin. Her doctor explained that she had gone into heart failure. Rick's niece, Becky, had a 1-year-old baby named Carrie who also had a heart problem. Carrie had open heart surgery 3 weeks before Rachel was born. Becky said, ever since I found out Carrie had a heart problem, I've been asking God why, and now I know why. God allowed Carrie to have a heart problem so we could help you with Rachel. Becky gave us the names and telephone numbers of Carrie's doctors, who started giving us advice over the phone. My mom and dad, who had come for Rachel's birth, stayed in Iloilo with Ricky, while Rick, Rachel, her doctor, and I flew to Manila. Philippine Airlines would not allow any baby under the age of 21 days to fly, and Rachel was only 1 week old. Rachel's doctor went to the airport and told them that Rachel would die if she didn't fly immediately to Manila, and her death would be their fault. We landed in Manila, where an ambulance met us at the airport and rushed us to the hospital. We were allowed to look at her through a glass window for 30 minutes twice a day. Dr. Reyes told us Rachel had aortic stenosis. He said, "I've performed the surgery before, but none of the babies have lived." Clark Air Force Base was our only hope, as Dr. Reyes stressed. There's no way your baby can survive the long flight to the States. In fact, I'm sure the airline will not even allow her to make the flight. Rick's sister Connie and her husband Bill Graves, who was in the Oklahoma State Legislature, were friends with Congressman Mickey Edwards, a born-again Christian. He kindly agreed to call Clark Air Base and ask for a favor. A decision was soon reached for the base hospital, some 60 miles away, to send an ambulance for Rachel. I rode with her while Rick flew back to Iloilo to get Ricky. Clark Air Base was the top neonatal hospital in all of Asia. The doctors and nurses were taking care of babies who had been flown in from the U.S. bases all over the Asian region. When we arrived at the base, Rachel was immediately taken to ICU. After she had been examined and her monitors were in place, I was allowed to hold her for the first time in a week. It was extremely difficult to see her submitted to all the necessary blood tests, shots, and IVs. Any mother who has been through that kind of experience knows what I'm talking about. I saw a very young doctor, in fact, the same quiet doctor who had ridden with us in the ambulance, doing an echocardiogram on Rachel. Another doctor walked up to me and commented, "Don't let his age fool you. That's Dr. Bradley Yoder, and he's brilliant." A friend met Rick and Ricky at the Manila airport and drove them to the base. Rick spent countless hours going back and forth from the U.S. Embassy to the base, over an hour's drive, going through mounds of paperwork and red tape, trying to get a passport and birth certificate for Rachel. The State Department was really giving him a hard time. It almost seemed as if they didn't care whether our baby lived or died. Meanwhile, the doctor had decided that Rachel's problem was too serious for even Clark's neonatal unit to handle. That's when I knew she didn't have a chance. I started preparing myself to lose her while they started preparing her for the long medevac flight. All her major organs were shutting down. Her lungs were filled with fluid. Her kidneys and liver were in the beginning stage of shutting down. It was going to cost thousands of dollars to fly her on the medevac, and several thousands more for the three of us. So Rick and I decided we had to fly commercial. We were also looking at heart surgery that would cost thousands of dollars once we reached the United States. We felt helpless. I sat in the chair in the hospital and held my tiny daughter for what I was sure was the last time. Dr. Harry Laws walked into where I was holding Rachel and introduced himself to me and promised he'd take good care of her. She was to be his only patient on that huge plane. When Mom and Dad found out that Rachel was having surgery in the U.S., they quickly packed and flew to Manila to catch an international flight. Needless to say, that was the longest flight of my life. I cried and prayed and read my Bible the whole way. I read 1 Peter 5:7 and 10 over and over, casting your care upon him, for he careth for you. But the God of all grace, who called us into his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that ye have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. I knew Rachel wasn't going to make it. I could see it in the faces of the doctors and nurses at the base. I saw it in the faces of those at the Manila Heart Center. I silently planned her funeral. We landed in San Francisco and called Travis Air Force Base to see if Rachel had survived the flight. We found out she had and had already been transported to Children's Hospital in Oklahoma City. We called there and learned that Rick's family and my sister were waiting outside of surgery. We had given power of attorney to Dr. Laws and the doctors at Children's because we knew Rachel would be arriving there long before us and would need surgery before we could arrive to sign the papers. When our plane touched down in Denver, we again made frantic calls to Children's Hospital. Dr. Razuk informed us that another doctor, Dr. Ward, had discovered another problem with Rachel's heart called a coarctation of the aorta. Before they performed the necessary surgery on the aortic valve, the coarctation of the aorta had to be corrected first. Later we learned if the work had been done on the aortic valve without correcting the coarctation first, she would have died on the operating table. Dr. Razuk told Rick by phone that they had turned her from the back opened her from the back for her coarctation, and now that part of the surgery was done. He further explained that she was being turned over to open her chest. He added that she was stable. Rick asked what was the next after the valve was repaired, and Dr. Razuk explained the riskiest part came when they took her off the heart-lung machine because sometimes the heart failed to start beating again on its own. My husband asked what could be done if that happened, expecting an answer like put her back on the machine and try again, but we were shocked by Dr. Razuk's answer. There is nothing we can do. We've lost her. We realized more than ever how important our prayers were for our little daughter's life. Rick hung up the phone and we boarded the last plane and flew to Oklahoma City. We took our time getting off the plane because we knew someone was waiting for us to tell us that Rachel didn't make it. With heavy hearts, we slowly walked down the ramp. Then I spotted my sister standing at the doorway, jumping up and down and shouting that she was okay. I started weeping uncontrollably. In fact, I don't think I stopped crying for several days. Little did we know that while we were being driven to the hospital, Rachel's heart went into fibrillation while the doctors were sewing up her chest. Immediately, they ripped open her chest and started massaging her heart. Dr. Razuk went in to tell the family. Totally unaware of complications, we jubilantly arrived at the hospital and started hugging everyone when Connie took my hand and said there had been a problem. Our spirits plummeted, but before she had time to explain, Dr. Razuk walked into the waiting room. We all froze. He smiled and said, "She's stable." A few minutes later, Dr. Elkins walked in and told us about the surgery. The heart of a newborn is about the size of a strawberry. The aorta, the largest artery in the body, is smaller than a thread. It was mind-boggling to think of opening a tiny hole in her aortic valve, which was almost completely closed. Too large an opening would kill her. It had to be just big enough to let blood flow through for a few years until she'd be old enough to have the valve replaced. The hospital chaplain took us to the ICU. The room was filled with tiny beds cradling tiny patients with lots of doctors and nurses. It was terrifying to see the countless tubes and machines connected to Rachel. One nurse and one resident were assigned to her and her alone. She was terribly bloated. "It's okay to cry," the chaplain said. Rick said, "We can't cry. We've cried all the way here. We don't have any tears left." I said, "We can't cry. She's alive." Rachel was now 17 days old. After her heart surgery, she was in recovery and we were facing huge bills. The bill for the Air Force Medivac alone was over $5,000. Rachel's heart surgery at Children's was over $20,000. This was back in 1986. It'd be more now. We also had to consider the airfare for Ricky and I. More importantly, could we possibly take such a sick child to the mission field? God gently reminded me, haven't I taken care of Rachel so far? Can't you trust me to finish the job? Didn't you give Rachel to me? God is not just good when things are going our way. He's good even when things are not going our way. We asked Dr. Razuk, when do you think we can take Rachel home? We were expecting an answer like, are you nuts? You're not taking this baby back to the Philippines, are you? But he only said 1 month. I sent the Air Force a check for $1,000 explaining our situation. I told them we could not pay the whole amount now, but promised we'd make payments until it was paid in full. But the Air Force sent back our $1,000 and said it was gratis. As for Rachel's medical bills, much was taken care of with the generous love offerings from God's people all over America. God was obviously opening the doors for us to be able to return to the mission field. I'm amazed when I look back and remember all the miracles involved. The procedure performed on Rachel was fairly new. If she had been born a couple years before, she probably would have died. Clark Air Base closed shortly after Rachel's birth due to the eruption of Mount Pinatubo volcano. If she had been born a couple years later, she could not have been put on the medevac. She would have died in that Manila hospital. Mickey Edwards retired from Congress shortly after Rachel's surgery. Who else would Connie and Bill know to contact who was in a position to call Clark Air Base and ask for a favor? When Rachel arrived at Children's and had all the preliminary tests done, the doctors and surgeons found 3 critical heart defects, not just one. If they had gone ahead and performed emergency surgery at Clark Air Force Base without first correcting the other defects, she would have died at the base hospital. A year after she was born, Dr. Bradley Yoder was transferred to another base. Perhaps another doctor would have gone ahead and tried to perform the surgery on her. All these thoughts kept going around in my mind as I kept asking God why He allowed this to happen to Rachel. God could have let Rachel be born without a heart defect after all. But if our lives are trouble-free all the time, how can God teach us anything? If we have no problems, how can we learn to trust Him? If everything's good all the time, you know how it is. We don't need Him. It's when the trials come that we learn to lean on Him. When we're going through the fire, that's when the Lord reveals Himself to us and shows us His miracles. He held our hand the whole way. When the newborn baby arrived at Tinker Air Base in Oklahoma City all by her tiny self, a television camera crew was there to meet her. The baby was accompanied from the Philippines by Dr. Harry Law, Lieutenant Colonel and pediatrician from Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Rachel was on the nightly news 3 days in a row, as well as the front page of the local newspaper. Radio stations were calling for interviews. Here's some of the articles. But my favorite is the one that my husband wrote that was published. She thanked the doctors and the hospitals and Congressman Edwards and the Air Force. The last paragraph said, the Oklahoma City news media, both electronic and print, deserve great credit for making the churches and people of Oklahoma aware of Rachel's story. Their prayers made the difference because in the end it was God who healed Rachel.